What's up, guys? It's Stuart Angus from McCowan. Good morning. It's very early in the morning here, but I kind of wanted to, address some of these questions that I saw on Warhammer Weekly because maybe I have a slightly different opinion to what's going on with AOS 4. Of course, we've had many discussions over the past few weeks about, perhaps the number of tournament attendees has been going down. There was that thread on Reddit, which the Honest Wargamer covered. Highly recommend you check out that video. But overall, the community's in discussion about, is AOS 4 in a good state? Now, to kind of inform you of my history of this, so obviously I did that big manifest video last year where I talked about all the things that I wanted them to fix in AOS 4 that they hadn't. And for the most part, they've actually addressed a lot of those problems that I spoke about in those videos. And actually, one of the regrets that I had in that video was talking about the priority. So, for those who don't know, they changed the priorities such that now, there actually is a downside for taking the double turn that lasts for more than just one turn, and you can't do the thing which I hated, which was you could be underdog going into round 2 and then double turn and have 5 command points and the underdog bonus, which they've got rid of, which is nice. But still, there is some dissatisfaction about the state of the game. And for me, I feel like my opinion is slightly different to what other people's are. And it's actually been something that's boiling under the surface in this game for a while now. And I kind of want to talk about that today. Where fundamentally, I kind of feel like there's 2 games going on at the moment. And they're a bit in conflict with each other, and one of them is more practically applicable than the other. Okay? So, I've felt like this for a while, that there's a gap between Tabletop Simulator and real life. Okay? And that gap, I would boil down to essentially, it's much more easy to be precise and play lots of models on Tabletop Simulator. Right. So what does that mean? Well, it means armies like, say if I just go into Listbot now, or maybe we can look at the Release the Beast 9.5 list. So I did well with this list in Release the Beast 1.5, right? And this is an example of an army which I think is fundamentally quite unplayable in real life. Okay, so let me just find this here. We have a... here we go. So, and I did play this on the weekend in real life. I did out of one day. I did go 3-0, but I didn't feel like it was anywhere near as strong or as easy to play in real life. Okay, so basically, it's a Daughters of Cain list with a bunch of auras and 80 models. Okay. For those who followed me for Worlds, I played something very similar with Skaven at last year's Worlds in AOS 3, and I encountered the same problems. Okay? And here's the problem with these lists, okay? It's actually physically impossible to be as precise as, a Scandinavian opponent would want you to be when you play this sort of list. Okay, I'm just going to be frank about that, because, that particular region of the world, they are a little bit more... strict with making sure every model moves the precise amount of distance and such, okay? And it means if you're playing this sort of list and you're playing it on a clock, it just won't work, alright? Or unless you're insanely practiced and in great physical condition and pumped up on a bunch of Red Bulls, it's very hard to play this for 6 games. Now, I played a list like this, and I didn't play it for 6 games. I played 2 tournaments, and then singles, and then the teams event at Worlds. So I basically played, 21 games in 3 weeks, okay? And in that period, I felt like I got better on the clock, but the games where the clock was an issue was more to do with my opponent double-checking every move, making sure that, all my distances were absolutely accurate, which is just not actually feasible with this sort of list, okay? This list is absolutely playable. I think if you play in somewhere like America, where people are a little bit more lenient, or, even Australia, I'd just say anywhere outside of Europe. As soon as you get to Europe, particularly, northwestern Europe, I think it becomes quite difficult. So, that is one aspect of the game that's kind of been bubbling under the surface for me is that there are these very good lists like this one. In this Release the Beast, I did win all my games and with big point scores because this is a great list, but it's not a good list in real life. So there's this kind of thing going on where, okay, well, there's these really strong armies that exist. This is an example of one of them, right? And there's been historically a lot of these sorts of horde armies. You know, I would say Gits as well is another army that's been stronger on TTS than it has been in real life. People have done okay in real life on Gits, but you ask which region of the world have they done well? America, right? And it's like, well, the reason you can do well in America is because they're not going to double check every single one of your moves, right? So there's this thing bubbling under the surface where there's these complex, buff-focused melee horde armies that take a long time to play if your opponent double checks every move, that are strong on TTS because you can be accurate without your opponent, you know, having to double check all the moves because you can just do the auto measure and such, right? And drag select move the models, they'll move accurately. Okay, stuff like this, okay? So this is the stuff that's kind of overperforms in TTS in my mind, right? Because in real life, you pick this up, people double check moves, it's a pain in the ass, okay? So these lists have been going on, and at the same time, we've seen, you know, now, I'm not throwing shade here whatsoever at Azura, right? But this list, which I'm just grabbing here because it's in front of me, right? But everyone and their dog has been playing this sort of list, right? Which is the opposite of this. This is an army that is actually worse on TTS than in real life, right? Because people can be more precise with the deployment. And people can also play armies that have more bodies, which is a sort of counter to this sort of list. But in real life, it's a nightmare. And there's absolutely no barriers to playing this army in real life, right? You can afford Varangard, I guess that's the barrier. But in terms of moving the models around, you have 20 Chosen, 6 Varangard, a Hero, and 6 Furies. Okay, great army in real life. Alright, the terrain piece takes up more space than the rest of your army in your luggage. You might not even bring it, okay? So, that's what's been kind of bubbling under the surface for me, is that there's these sorts of two lists, and after the weekend where, I don't play in real life that much, because there's not that many opponents for me to play in Japan, but with the tournament, I kind of was feeling a bit shit about the games, to be honest. Everyone I played was lovely. I had good games as well. It was nothing to do with that, but I kind of felt like I could feel that in real life, the game that I want it to be, which is more, where these things are viable, where you can have, a mix of kind of easy to play armies like this, and then the horde armies that give more skill expression, stuff like this, right? You can have a mix of those in the game. Whereas in real life, as soon as you introduce those armies into the game, there's so many problems. There's so many problems that all of which appeared at last year's Worlds, right? Last year's Worlds, okay, obviously Australia came fourth, but I think from the people who played multiple years in a row, which including me, there was the most bullshit rule shenanigans, which almost every team was participating in, including mine, right? About, getting certain rulings, those rulings not being known by every player, shenanigans on the clock, different standards of what measuring stuff is. There was just so much of this stuff at Worlds that did harm the enjoyment, I think, of a lot of the people that were there, okay? And for me, that really highlighted that Warhammer as a game, it's like, it doesn't work the way that the rules are necessarily laid out, if you understand what I mean. Like, if you go into a game and you're as ridiculously precise with the rules that you would be in another game like, Magic, or even a literal video game, okay? If you're that strict with the rules, it just won't work as a game. So Warhammer has to be a social contract sort of game, okay? And in those sort of social contract sort of games, only then can we actually have a balanced metagame. And the social contract is, and you're all going to be really uncomfortable with this, right? The social contract has to be, the amount of accurate I have to be is proportional to the amount of models I have in my army. That sounds really, uncomfortable, and I'm sure many of you people, if you brought more models than me, doesn't mean that you get to be less precise than I am. But that is the only way that this game can work. Otherwise, if we hold each other to insane measurement standards, you will see this sort of list become the main modus operandi in Warhammer. So for me, that's actually the problem at the moment, is that the standard that we're holding to each other in terms of measurement doesn't allow us to bring armies that do supply counters to many of the game's unbalanced things like the Slates of Darkness list, right? So is that an AOS 4 problem, is the question? Or has that existed the whole time? No, I think it's existed the whole time. What's changed in AOS 4 is that there are more of these lists than there used to be. So now there's more of an option to play a relatively simple list and succeed, as opposed to before where, there are a lot more armies in the middle of, having a lot of models that you needed to move with relative accuracy, right? So that, I believe, is the biggest problem with AOS 4. So I want to say headline is, okay, the thing I want to articulate is this, right? The amount of models you have should be negatively proportionate. Let me write it the other way around. The amount of accuracy with which you must move your models should be inversely proportionate to how many there are. Okay? I know so many of you, probably people watching, are going to be kind of uncomfortable with this, but this is the only way this game can work, in my opinion. If this isn't true, then what we're basically saying is, yes, there are horde armies that could be good. There are armies that have, very precise things they need to do, but you can't play them because you don't have enough time. And for me, that's not really the conclusion I want us to get to, because then basically you're saying, in order for an army to be good, the models have to be expensive. Right? Because then, only then, can you have a Daughters of Cain army that has, 40 models instead of 80, right? Only then can you have a viable army. And I don't like that conclusion. I liked playing with big armies in Age of Sigmar, I always have. But this problem has always been there. I go there on a 2-day event locally. I can totally play the army. But as soon as I go to International Warhammer, I have to play against, again, the Scandinavians and co. Yeah, we all know this at this point, okay? It's not a big secret that there's a difference there, okay? We play those sorts of regions, and suddenly these armies are not playable anymore, right? And so from the perspective of someone sending a team to Worlds, I'm not going this year, but I have been in the previous 3 years, I've been concerned about playing these sorts of armies. And it was a problem when I played Skaven at Worlds. This sort of thing, okay? Right. So that's the first thing I want to say, is I think that the amount of accuracy with which you must move your models should be inversely proportionate to how many there are. And I think that would fix a lot of problems if we kind of accepted this social contract as a community. Okay, but I want to address some of the other things that were talked about. And the reason I talked about that point first is it kind of branches off from that. So, the first thing that was raised in the Warhammer Weekly video was that many items have been simplified. Reactions, list building, all this sorts of thing. And it makes the game flatter, and how do we feel this worked out? So, I think flatter in this respect can mean a few things. I think one of the first things it can mean is that between army allegiances, there are more commonalities than there used to be, right? It used to be, for example, countercharge. Only a small percentage of armies had this. Now everyone has it. Power through, there were similar abilities. Now everyone has it, and so on, right? There are many things where a lot of armies have similar abilities. We have access to the same endless spell laws for the most part, and so you see a lot of morbid conjuration historically. Now things are a bit more balanced, but, you see a flatness in the sense of a lot of armies are taking similar things. There's a flatness in the sense that a lot of armies end up taking similar looking sort of army builds. I think Stormcast, Slates of Darkness, OBR, and Ironjaws are incredibly similar armies. They've decided that these are the 4 entry points to each Grand Alliance via 3-up save nonsense, and yeah, that makes the game feel a bit flatter, especially when 2 of those armies are the most popular armies, and also very strong. So that makes the game feel flatter in that aspect. Yeah. Now, there are more tools in the game for interaction, but what I would say is that they've cleaned them up to the point where it doesn't feel as soul-crushing when your opponent interjects as they used to, right? It just kind of feels like you do your thing, your opponent does their thing, right? So that kind of goes into the clear upsides of 4.0 so far. I'll get into list building next because that's down there. But I think overall the flatness of the game has been an improvement in the sense of things being relatively simplified on the tabletop. There's less, random timing jank that I hated in Age of Sigmar 3. Towards the end of Age of Sigmar 3, I know Tom Megan said in the video that it was the best state Age of Sigmar has been in. From the balance perspective, I'd say it's true. But from the gameplay perspective, there were so many weird rules and interaction nonsense that some people might enjoy, but for me, it caused a lot of conflict at the tabletop, especially at a competitive level. And I don't think it was actually a viable game towards the end of third. It was a broken, beaten, battered game at the end of AOS 3. Like, it was torn to pieces, facts everywhere. Like, if you could just imagine an office filled with paper on the floor, that's what it felt like playing AOS 3 for me at the end. It just felt fundamentally broken, and we just had to patch so many holes to make the game even playable. That was my opinion of AOS 3. Now, on top of that, there was great balance in terms of the balance between the armies. For the most part, was great. Okay? So that was kind of my read of AOS 3. AOS 4, we don't have paper over the floor anymore, but yeah, obviously the balance between the armies is definitely better now, but there's still some problems. And there are problems to do with the overall ontology of the game. One of which I spoke about earlier, which I'll get into when we get into list building. Okay. The clear upsides of AOS 4, I would say, are, they've improved the timings. We no longer have paper all over the floor. Okay, yes, we have some errata, but it's not like, before was ridiculous how much, rules shenanigans we needed to even just mend the ship back together that was AOS 3. None of that. I would say for the most part, it's a lot faster game time-wise than AOS 3. That's been something that I've observed. Even playing some slow armies, I've never felt like the same pressure on the clock or same pressure of timing as the previous one. And yeah, I'd say it's actually easier to understand than AOS 3 in a lot of ways. So I mostly enjoy 4.0 in the mechanical rules interaction standpoint, I would say. There are some problems. One thing I think they failed at was getting this declare effect thing to work properly, and what is a passive versus not a passive. That kind of thing, I think I could go in an afternoon and fix the whole thing. We might do that for a video. But to me, there just seems to be some keywords missing. Manifestation's another aspect of which I kind of feel like they made very difficult for themselves. Here, guys, I'm just going to fix the problem for you. We go in tomorrow, and we introduce the predatory endless spell keyword. Okay. Predatory endless spells do this, and then you call the other ones static endless spells. All right? We have static endless spells and predatory endless spells. We have them as a keyword. We have keyword subheadings in the core rules that describe what each of those things do. Done. Okay? Whereas, an endless spell without a movement characteristic. That is nonsense, alright? We can just replace that with static, and then, it's all in the same paragraph, and also in several spots, so it's just very, very messy. That could just be fixed with 2 keywords, okay? Some examples of things they could fix in 4.0. Alright, list building. Let's get into list building. Okay, so, I don't think that list building is bad at AOS 4. Okay, I think I'm one of the only people probably who has this opinion. Um, I'm gonna kind of talk about why I don't think it's so bad. Um, so what I would say is that if you are stuck on one army, okay, so let's say I am, what's a bad army to list build with? I am an ogres player. Okay, or no, here's an even worse one. I am a Lumineth player, and I want to do a list build, and I have some models, and maybe some models I'm thinking about buying, and I'm getting frustrated because I add a Cathalar to my list, and look, I cannot take Sentinels, okay? Right, this is an example of something they probably need to fix. Okay, but what if you're someone who owns 15 armies? Which should be me, right? What if you own basically every army that's not an order army, right? Then I would say the list building is great. Like if you want to get a grasp on how to list build with like 15 armies, if that's something that you enjoy, which I do, right? This is great. Because it's relatively streamlined, right? Like if I want to run a Slaves of Darkness list, there's fundamentally like not that many choices of how I'm going to create this list, right? Like I know that I'm going to have to probably think about fitting in a field sergeant if I'm going to run an infantry focus list, and for that I'm going to have to take X hero and X hero inside them. I know the sort of units that I'm comparing in terms of efficiency, right? Like when I'm talking at the hammer, we're looking at, okay, I can literally just sit down and work out the math between Varangard, Theridons, and Chosen, right? We're going to work out which are the best here, and we're going to take those. So, yes, it's streamlined and relatively simple, but if you own a lot of armies, it can be interesting to kind of get a really large view of the game by list building across a broad range of things. Before, it was so difficult to get a grasp on list building of every army because there were just kind of unlimited options, right? And that meant that if you were someone who has an interest in playing a lot of different armies and getting a broad kind of perspective on the game, that was bad. So I am talking obviously from a tabletop simulator player's perspective kind of a little bit here because, you know, we have access to all the armies. So being able to list build with a broad range of armies. There is only one army I haven't played this edition, by the way. I've only not played KO. I have played every army multiple games this edition, okay? And that has led to me having kind of like this broad perspective of what the game feels like that I didn't have in AOS 3 because it was just too difficult to get my head around every single army. There's just too many rules, right? Whereas now, because the game is so streamlined, you can list build with almost every army and know the rules of every army pretty relatively simply, right? If you just sit down and you just try to put to memory all the rules in the game, you'll be able to do it now. And that was much more difficult before. So, if you're interested in getting your perfect, like, you know, blend of spices in your particular army, like you're just a one army Andy, okay, and you have, you know, okay, like, for example, my friend Orcman, I only play orcs. Yes, particularly with orcs, there's not that many options, okay? So, if you're interested in that sort of thing, I would say that the list building is bad. But if you're interested in having a relatively simple, refinable approach to getting armies out in a broad range of settings, like, you know, getting to the most efficient list relatively quickly, it's quite interesting. So if you're a captain at, you know, like a Worlds event or another team event, it can be actually better, I think, from your perspective. Now, what is good list building from an objective standpoint? That's the difficult thing to define, okay? So I think some people who take issue with the AOS list building, it would be that there's not enough options at the moment. And from a certain perspective, that's correct. But in terms of being able to recover streamlined army identities as fast as possible through list building and be able to refine them quickly, it's the best it's ever been. So, just depends what you like. If you like finding, you know, the great build as fast as possible, then it's great. But if you're looking at finding something that fits your particular playstyles and like to refine it over tons and tons of games, it's not going to work, because you're gonna reach a point where there's nothing you can change out that's more efficient than the list you have. All right. Okay, what do we want out of the battle tomes? Well, for me, I think some of the battle tomes have been relatively interesting. In terms of the way that they've reshaped the allegiance abilities. We've seen Slates of Darkness, which I think was a buff to the allegiance abilities, and then we've seen Gits, which I think is, for all intents and purposes, a nerf. But for the most part, they've been largely the same with all the rule scrolls in there, and some of the rules that are printed in the battle tomes are also just wrong, like, because they've been updated and then they haven't been updated. I don't know if this is gonna get me in trouble, but like, just don't buy the battle tomes. Like, just don't. I mean, yeah, because look, it's not me making Age of Index, but it exists, right? So it exists. I would never argue to pirate anything, but as long as the information is like sort of out there, or you can use the past information of the battle tomes of the war scrolls that we did have for free, that's a thing. But it kind of feels like to me that if you're a company that wants people to buy your products, then make them actually do something. Because all that it is now is the battle tome comes out, and the battle tome is for the most part a worthless piece of crap. And the only thing that makes it worth it is the fact that you lock the rules behind a paywall. So you're kind of like constructing artificial value there. And we as a community are very attuned to the smell of artificial value, okay? Like, if something actually doesn't have any value, and you're essentially making it have value by saying that it's expensive, right? It kind of sounds like a crypto scam, right? So you're kind of actually lightly scamming people with the battle tomes, is what I would say. So I would suggest not buying them, and I would not encourage the behavior they're doing, which is essentially releasing largely low-value products and selling them at a premium, just because they're locking you out of the rules that already exist. Yeah. So, is faction terrain just a liability? Yes, sometimes it is. And yes, it feels weird. And yes, it feels weird that you can charge faction terrain but not other terrain on the board. I don't like the faction terrain rules, but I will say I hated them in 3 as well. So, I don't know what the solution is, but in AOS 3, where you could just block off certain sections of the board with no counterplay. Like, I remember with Skaven, right? If you guys remember the old battle tactic Surround and Destroy, where you had to have units, wholly outside your territory, and then, like, wholly within 6 of the board edge kind of thing, right? Yeah, I used to just put 2 gnaw holes off in it on the sides, and then you couldn't do it. so okay, the fact that that's gone now is probably good, okay, but I don't know if the current faction terrain rules are particularly fun, especially if you have kind of a low impact terrain feature. And what would be the most positive potential changes? Alright, we need a comprehensive players code to address the issue I talked about before, about not always being 100% mirrored in your leniency. It actually, I didn't kind of buy into this before, but I talked about this before, but it actually kind of buys into kind of a philosophy in life that I think is interesting, which is, if you treat everyone exactly the same, you're actually being unfair, okay? And that, I think, kind of, is part of this, right? Like, you should treat people the way that is most adapted to whatever their circumstance is. Obviously, if someone has a disability where they can't walk up the stairs, then perhaps we should provide a ramp. Things like this, right? Which, as a modern society, we have all decided is reasonable. But for some reason, as gamers, we're still kind of in this mentality of, like, we need to hold each other to exactly the same standard. And I just don't think it's really fair. If you have, Sons of Behemoth, I don't think that you should be, like, walking around with the tape measure, double-checking everyone's movement. But your opponent is allowed to be as precise with you as they want, because you have 4 models, right? I think that that's fair. I I think that, yeah, the amount of models, as I said, should be, inversely proportionate to how much your opponent is harsh with you. I just think that that's fair. Otherwise, again, it just doesn't work as a game. Like, that's my problem, right? Like, the counter argument would be, well, but that's not really fair. I know it's not, but what is your answer then? Because, like, for me, all you're saying is that armies with fewer models, therefore, are stronger than armies that have more models. And I'm not comfortable with that conclusion. I think that speaks to fundamentally broken game. So either the game is fundamentally broken, or we have to play it this way. It's up to you. Now, what would be the most positive potential changes? To me, I would say... the sub-commander thing is something that does need looking at. I would just remove them completely, in my opinion. I would just remove... I would remove the limits. So I would say you can have up to 10 battalions. I would remove all the sub-commanders from the game. So if you want to go 1-drop, you have to have 1 hero. If you want to have 2-drop, you got to have 2 heroes, alright? And then we're making heroes a little bit stronger, okay? And then I think if we do all those sorts of things, you'll start to see some interesting lists. We keep the field sergeant thing, but just make it so you can pick a, maybe we say a hero leading a regiment, that's not your general's regiment or something like that. I don't know. Just find some way to keep field sergeant in there. Or make it so only your general can take sub-commander or something like that. Your hero can take, your general can take any other hero in their regiment. Just some streamlined approach like this, right? Remove the limits on battalions. So if people want to take 6 heroes, they can take 6 heroes or 7 heroes or whatever, right? I think that's fine. But they could be high drop. That's fine. I don't think anyone will have issue with that. And then I think we'll be okay. Because the more we extend the sub-commander thing, the more the drops system as it is will break. Okay? Because what will happen is then you end up with, these kind of... It just becomes really arbitrary, like who is high drop versus low drop. Whereas I think what you're trying to do with the drop system is to say if you have more synergies, more ways to buff up your army, then you're not going to get to choose who goes first, right? And I think that's basically saying if your army is more consistent in the sense of its output, it will become less consistent in the tempo that it follows in the game. So if you are a low reliability army, you'll be able to at least set the tempo of the game. That's the balancing proposition here, right? But if we are a 2-drop or a 3-drop that has all the consistency, and then now you're playing against 4-drops that have the consistency, but now you have the choice of the turn, that is where it starts to feel like the system is breaking a bit, right? And there's plenty of armies as well where, the fact that you get 2 bonuses now, if you're like between a 4-drop and a 5-drop, you just go the 5-drop every time. And again, that kind of feels like I'm talking about where you have a choice of putting, a Grimwrath Berserker in a battalion to become 4-drop, or otherwise just be 5-drop. I think a lot of the time the correct decision there is to be 5-drop. And that is not really how it's supposed to work. So I think there's some weird incentives going on, where for the most part, if you're 3-drop, you're kind of getting fucked by both sides, right? Because you're not going to get... Like, if you play versus a 2-drop, yes, you're going to get an extra thing, but you might not have the hero setup I was just talking about to make your army feel more consistent. So you're not really a consistent army. You're not getting to pick the turn, and then versus the other armies, you're not getting 2 honor guard abilities. That's where the game sort of breaks down to me. So I think the sub-commander thing is a mistake. What we should have instead is, maybe we go with your general can take 1 hero of any design. Or even if you just want to make it 1 hero with 10 or less wounds. Something like this, right? Whatever. And then no other sub-commanders, okay? Because otherwise, you're just going to eventually break this. Like, if you extend it so that every sub-commander, every regiment can have any sub-commander, I mean, you're just kind of just taking the piss at that point. So And then we're seeing the arbitrary shit of like Kragnos can't take anything, and now he can take 2 sub commanders and gets like, come on, like, you know, just it's stuff like this where you just feel like the system is just a bit like broken and beaten and battered, right? Yeah. So that's what I would say is my perspective on AOS 4. I do enjoy it, but again, what I'm struggling with is just that problem, right? Of there's this game that exists. My ideal version of the game, which is, you know, frankly, the TGS version of the game where you can kind of play everything, versus the real life thing where there's all sorts of constraints, inaccuracy, and frankly, there's some kind of like poor spirited gameplay that is making things a bit difficult for everyone. So that's where I'm at, and I will see you guys next time. Cheers.